So I'm Doug Johnson, the director of the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights, and I welcome you all. This is the third in a series of 6 talks that we're having at the Kennedy School this semester on the Obama human rights policy, the unfinished agenda. We wanted to know, especially those of us who had great hopes at the beginning, what that human rights policy has looked like, and where has it failed to achieve our hopes as well as its own objectives. And there's only 2 years left. What can we expect for the future for human rights under the Obama administration? So we've had 3 speakers. We will have 3 speakers who come from within the Obama administration, including Mike Posner 2 weeks ago, who was Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights for DRL, but who also was Elisa's boss.
My boss for 20 years. So, it's payback time now. I get to evaluate him.
It's only fair. Harvard believes in the 360 program on performance review. And we will have Maria Otero, who was Undersecretary of State for Human Rights, a position that our own Sarah Sewell just left to take over. And Harold Koh, the legal counsel of the State Department, is back at Yale Law, and he'll be our final speaker. But we also have 3 people who weren't in the administration, reflecting as activists and outsiders to the administration who've had to try and move it along, if you will, at one point. And last week, 2 weeks ago, we had Juan Mendez, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. We talked about the fact that he still cannot get an invitation to Guantanamo to visit as he should as the UN Special Rapporteur. And today we welcome Elisa Massimino, the president of Human Rights First, and we will, on April 3rd, welcome Lauren Craner, who was the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights under the first 4 years of the George W. Bush Foundation, or administration, and has just stepped down from a long leadership position as the president of the International Republican Institute. So I urge you all to come to that. And next time, do a better job of bringing 10 of your friends with you. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Elisa Massimino, who's really one of the great leaders of the human rights movement in the United States. 20 years, he was your boss, and not for another 5 years, so you've got at least 25 years working at Human Rights First, originally as Lawyers Committee. Elisa began as an attorney who got recruited in doing pro bono asylum work. It got in her blood, and she joined the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights as an attorney to help develop and train other attorneys to do asylum work. She started working in the Washington office for Human Rights Watch when it first developed, and she was a star from the beginning from the work there. So good that her boss in Washington felt he could step down from the position, Joe Eldridge, and turn it over to Elisa. And 5 years ago, Elisa became the president and CEO. It was 5 years, wasn't it, or longer?
No, 5 years.
Poor thing. The head of Human Rights First, which means, of course, one of the things she's doing here is raising money, so pull out your checkbooks.
We're going to pass the hat.
Yeah, pass the hat.
Because I know that this is really, the human rights crowd is really where all the money is. Right?
We've all been there, so we know the importance of solidarity. I just want to say that when I was director of the Center for Victims of Torture, every year we chose one person who had done something important for the care of survivors of torture or the prevention of torture. And I'm pleased to have 2 of those winners here in the table. First, Alberto Mora for his work within the Bush administration fighting the cruelty policy. And secondly, Elisa Massimino, for the extraordinary work she did for the human rights movement of recruiting unusual allies. That we often, as human rights people, tend to be talking to the same people around the table rather than reaching out and building constituencies. And what Elisa did was reach out to a group of retired military people, recruiting over 50 retired generals and admirals and another large cohort of former interrogators, CIA officials, other national security people who were upset to enraged about the decision of the Bush administration to use torture. In doing that, she did a great deal to blunt the pernicious argument that torture was somehow effective, as they both argued as professionals that not only it wasn't, but even if it was too corrosive and too much against Americans' values and what they attempt to instill in their young troops, that it was, even if it was tactically useful, it was strategically stupid. And I think that more than anyone else, Lisa brought this whole new aspect and whole new constituency into the human rights struggle. So I'm really pleased that you've come here. I'm very grateful to you, and I know I'm going to be fascinated by what you've thought about the last 6 years. So, Elisa Massimino.
Well, it's great to be here, and I really want to say thank you to Doug, who you all are very lucky to have here, who really was instrumental in helping us develop a new strategy to take on the torture policies of the Bush administration, and helped us think outside the box and really helped galvanize the community around a new strategy. That was a game changer. So you guys are it's really fun for me to be here and spending the day talking about new tactics in human rights with the guy who invented that term. And also my friend and colleague Jill Savitt, who was in the trenches with us also at the beginning of all of that work, and is one of the most innovative thinkers in human rights that I've ever come across, and we're really happy to have her working with us again. And obviously Alberto, who again, you all are so lucky to have him in your midst here. Whenever you have the opportunity to hear him talk, you should run and again bring 20 of your friends, because he is, he's one of my heroes. And I don't have that many, and he's one of them. So he wrote an extraordinary memo that Jane Mayer wrote about in the New Yorker magazine. And when that memo came out, I remember I have a lot of friends who are lawyers who work in government, and I sent that memo along with the John Yoo torture memos as attachments to an email to all of my friends who are lawyers in government, and just said, the subject line was, "What kind of lawyer are you?" And there's a choice, and Alberto continues to be a hero in that fight. So I have a bunch of prepared remarks here, but this is a more intimate gathering. So I'm going to maybe touch on a few things, talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll just have a conversation. And there's no way I can cover all the issues that we could talk about. The Obama human rights policy. So I'll just touch on a few. In particular, the ones that we have worked very closely on, Human Rights First. But if you're hoping for like a report card or a grade or a kind of a BuzzFeed score or whatever, you won't be happy, because it's complicated. It's a very complex picture, I think, and the president still has more than half a term left. And also, what you think about his human rights record probably depends on what you expected, when he came in. Hope, change, all of that. and also what you use as a benchmark for deciding, or giving that grade. Some people, for example, believed when Obama came in that he would very quickly and decisively align the country's counterterrorism policies with respect for human rights and international law. And, in some ways, I think that's never a realistic hope, no matter who the president is. Presidents just tend not to give away power that they have. No executive does that easily, regardless of their intentions. There are lots of other powerful interests in government, in Congress, military, intelligence agencies. They all have their own ideas. So it's never as easy or straightforward as it seems during the campaign. So if you had extraordinarily high hopes for all of that, you were probably disappointed. But, even if you didn't have such high hopes and you're mindful of the institutional constraints and the opposition in Congress and historical trends, you may have good reason to have thought that the record would have been stronger than it's been. On the other hand, I think that Obama's human rights record is stronger than a lot of his critics claim it is. For instance, the complaint that you often hear from some quarters that President Obama is just like Bush on counterterrorism, I think that's not only overly simplistic, but not true. Yes, there's some continuity between, his policies and the previous presidents, but there are just as many points of departure, and there's some really important ones. Obviously, human rights is more than counterterrorism, and that also will, what aspect of human rights you're looking at also will color how you would judge Obama's record so far. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights guarantees not just political freedoms and civil liberties, but also the right to membership in a labor union and education and a decent standard of living. And so how strong you think Obama's record is sort of depends on what constellation of issues that you want to focus on. If, for example, one of the issues that you care about in human rights is health care, the picture looks a little brighter. If one of them is immigration, with the record number of deportations that the Obama administration has undertaken, it's not as rosy a picture. So my own view of the Obama record is colored by the issues that we have focused on at Human Rights First. So I'm going to talk about 3 of those, and then we can talk about the other things that you're interested in. Counterterrorism, the Arab Spring uprisings, and international law and institutions generally. So before I get into the specifics about counterterrorism, I want to make a general kind of observation about President Obama's views of executive authority, which I would argue are discernibly different from that of his predecessor. Remember, President Bush invoked Article 2 of the Constitution to ignore congressional and judicial constraints on his authority, and President Obama has not done that. Think about there's a case at Guantanamo, the Al-Dahani case, where the court ruled that the laws of war don't bind the administration's detention authority. And the Obama administration argued against that interpretation, saying that the laws of war do bind their own authority, and they apply in that case. So that's a very rare instance where a White House is actually rejecting power that a court was trying to give it. So we can debate the extent to which that pro-rule of law view has influenced the administration's actions overall, but I think it's important in and of itself, and it tells a story about the administration, at least its overall intent about the binding nature of international law that is different from its predecessor. So, but of course, when I talk about President Obama's record on human rights and counterterrorism, I find myself a lot of time saying, on the one hand this, and on the other hand that. There's a lot of that. First on an issue that we have spent an extraordinary amount of time working on, torture, what Doug talked about. After 9/11, we put together this coalition of retired generals and admirals who were adamant in their view that inhumane treatment of prisoners was wrong, was ineffective, and undermined the war effort, actually. And those retired generals and admirals met with Obama when he was a candidate. They also met with most of the other presidential candidates in '08. And then in the days before the inauguration, the transition team called us and said that he wants to make that a priority, and could we assemble the group. He wants to issue executive orders as his first action as President of the United States to make clear that torture is illegal and to restore the primacy of the Geneva Conventions. And these generals and admirals who had met with him as a candidate, who we assembled, were standing in the Oval Office when he signed the executive order on torture and the other ones, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I think, it's maybe easy looking back on that to think that it was sort of inevitable that would happen, but it wasn't, and it really, really matters. Similarly, the executive order signed on that same day to outlaw the secret CIA prisons, and the decision to disclose the torture memos, those were all incredibly hard fought, not inevitable, and really important, and helped shift the public debate. On the other hand, I think, shortly thereafter, I was in a meeting, and several of us were called to the White House to meet with the president after, in the spring of '09, before the president was scheduled to give a major speech at the National Archives, laying out his overall counterterrorism and human rights policies. And that was one of those speeches, boy, if there was ever a on the one hand, on the other hand, you could hear the first half of the speech, which was all about torture, and how we weren't going to do it anymore. The collective cheer coming up out of all of the, corners of all of us who have been laboring so hard to make that happen. The second half of the speech was all about really the embrace of the previous paradigm, indefinite detention as a legitimate part of the framework, and military commissions as an important part of the framework. And in the meeting that we had, to his credit, we were sitting in the room with the President of the United States and debating with him before he gave the speech. We were heard. But the argument that I made in that meeting was that the previous administration had utterly shifted the paradigm to outside of human rights and the rule of law and international humanitarian law governing our struggle with terrorism, and that you could not make change stick without a more dramatic paradigm shift back that rejected the use of these military commissions, even though, yes, they had been marginally improved over time, and version 3 was better than version 1. And his response was, you can't turn an aircraft carrier on a dime. This is a massive policy, a lot of people invested in it, and it's got to turn slowly. And, arguably what we argued was going to happen is what happened. The force of that aircraft carrier just turned back to where it was in a lot of respects, not on torture, but in these other areas. So where his intention was to move people to the U.S. for trial, he wasn't able to accomplish that. In part, I think, because he bought into the framework, and once you do, you're kind of arguing around the details, and that's what happened. Also, the president's very understandable decision to, as he put it, look forward and not backward on torture has really deprived our country of a desperately needed public reckoning about what happened and what was done in our names. In the absence of any sort of comprehensive accounting, public support for torture has increased, actually, under the Obama administration. The polls show. The torture proponents have been out there. There's various books out of, from former CIA officials that talk about how instrumental torture was in saving lives, how cruelty worked and was necessary, and how we should be doing it again. And it's left a narrative that essentially is that, torture, it looks more like to the uninformed at least, as a policy preference, rather than, an immoral and illegal act. And that's a big problem. And that's why my organization is fighting so hard for the release of this Senate Intelligence Committee report on the CIA interrogation program. Some of you may have seen there was a little bit of news about that in the last couple of days, including this morning. Senator Feinstein went to the floor of the Senate and gave a very unusual for her public speech about the need to get this report out and her displeasure with the CIA in possibly spying on her staff who wrote this report and launching an investigation, asking the Justice Department for an investigation of the Senate Intelligence Committee staff. My view is that we won't be able to establish a durable consensus against torture in this country until we come to grips with what we gained, what we lost, what was really done in our names. And this report is the chance to do that. It's a fork in the road. And so we're throwing everything we have at trying to get it out. If the public's allowed to see this and the press is allowed to report on it, and we can really have an examination of what we gained. And I haven't read the report, but those who have suggest that it demonstrates that the program was more cruel and more widespread than we've been told, that what was the intelligence that was gained from the program was minimal at best, and the costs obviously were huge, and that the CIA lied to the committee and possibly even to the Bush White House about what it was getting under the program. So now the committee, thanks to these revelations about the CIA possibly spying on the Senate staff, is, I think, more committed than ever to getting the report declassified and released. But, President Obama has not said very much about this. Vice President Biden, in part because he is who he is, and somebody asked him what he thought, and he just said it, said in a public conversation with Senator McCain, who also favors getting the report out, by the way, and has been an incredible leader in this entire fight. He said he thought it should come out, and that's the only way we as a society can come to grips with what we did and make sure that it doesn't happen again. So another issue in this basket, obviously, is Guantanamo, and we have been working very hard. Sorry about the voice. And that was another subject for an executive order on that same day, the second day in office. Oh shoot, I left those things in your office, the blueprints. They're in the middle section of my bag. Not where the...
Don't say anything interesting.
I'm just getting started. Well, I'll tell you what Doug is going to get. So we used to do a report every 4 years, and the last one we did it, we actually did it jointly with the Carr Center, called In the National Interest, for the incoming administration, where we make the case that a strong human rights policy is actually in the national interest of the United States, and that it's a very hard concern. It's not kind of a soft or simply moralistic concern, but it actually impacts vital national interests of our country. That project, which was really a beautiful book, and it had a really nice cover, like all of these, but nobody ever read it because it was like more than 100 pages long. And so it morphed into these. There's a bunch of them, but you can pass these around. Into blueprints on human rights policies. So these are much more, I'll pass these around. These are just to give you an idea of the kind of work that we do, but also how we would judge Obama's human rights record. We decided that we would write these blueprints as if they're written for people who are sitting at, new in their seats in the administration, whose boss comes and says, hey, we promised we would close Gitmo. How do we do that? What do we do first? Where's the opposition? What do we have to... And so we did one on how to close Guantanamo. And actually the the president followed it to a point, and then lost his nerve, I would argue, after the Attorney General announced that they were going to try the 9/11 conspirators in Manhattan, and the powers that be there said it would cost $3 billion or something like that. And I think that the White House should have said okay and gone ahead with it. Instead, they didn't politically handle it all that well. And in fact, anyway, so closing down Guantanamo was it was a campaign promise, and it's hard to imagine now, but think back to the campaign in 2008. The candidates of both of the major parties were kind of fighting to see who would close it down faster, right? McCain or Obama. And then Colin Powell said, I would do it right now. I would just close it right now. So there was quite a lot of unanimity, at least in the political leadership, that that's what should happen. But then it foundered, and we can go into diagnosis about why that happened if you're interested in the Q&A. But last spring, after a mass hunger strike made it a front page issue again, and people were, on death's door, detainees at Guantanamo, we seized the momentum along with a lot of other groups who were working on this, and got it back on the front pages, and got the administration to re-engage. And the president appointed 2 special envoys to close Guantanamo, terrific people, one at state and one at DOD, who are staking their careers on making that happen. He got the review boards that he had ordered. What happens when the president and the leader of the free world orders that something happens in his own government, and then it doesn't happen for like 13 months? You wonder, is that any way to run a country? It's so funny because after that speech where he said, and we're going to do everything we can to close Guantanamo, we brought the retired generals and admirals to the White House to say, awesome, we are with you, to meet with the president's national security team to say, we're here to help. What, we assume, because we're generals, and when we give an order, stuff happens. And the president gave an order, and frankly, the meeting was, well, it's really hard, Congress is really hard, and they're making it really hard, and, we're going to try, but it's really hard. And the generals are like, wait a second, he's the commander-in-chief. Let us help you. But so things have started to move, and people have, started to return. And then, at the end of last year, we won some flexibility in Congress by pushing really, really hard and getting the administration to engage, to get the Defense Authorization Act to loosen the restrictions that Congress had placed on transferring people out of Guantanamo. So the pathway is starting to get clearer. There are a lot of hurdles that remain, obviously, and the key, as always, is political leadership, and that'll be the test for the president on that. And then on the terrorism trials and military commissions, again, that they went out there in a way that I think was admirable to say, we're going to do this, we have a system, our Article 3 courts can handle these cases, and that's where these people ought to be tried. And when there was political resistance, they just caved. The fact is, though, that there has been a transfer of Guantanamo detainee for trial in the middle of Manhattan, and nobody even cared. I mean, it didn't, all the parade of horribles that the political opponents said, oh my gosh, it's going to make Manhattan the target of this and that and terrorism, and it's going to cost a fortune. No, they just did it, and it happened. In fact, we did a hilarious video that you could probably find on YouTube, where we did a kind of man-on-the-street thing where we went around the courthouse and stuck a mic in front of New Yorkers, random New Yorkers, and said, do you know that a Guantanamo detainee is being tried right here in this courthouse? Aren't you scared about that? We played clips from Liz Cheney and all these people who said that, the sky will fall. And the New Yorkers were, you could not have, it was beautiful. It was just beautiful. They were like, whatever, the country's been around a long time. We know what courts do. We're not afraid. This is how we deal with things in a democracy. I'm sure the courts will be fine, and I've got business to attend to, so what are you talking to me for here? You have to go to work. It was great. And I wish we could capture that kind of spirit and, infuse the Justice Department with it. And instead, we're left with these military commission trials down at Gitmo, which are pathetic. I'm really worried about them, actually. They are, you're taking arguably the trial of the century, the 9/11 conspirators, and you're trying them in a system where the judge can't even say whether the Constitution applies, is confused. And the people trying the cases, while they are well-meaning, and the military teams who are doing this and the defense lawyers are trying to take it seriously, it's staffed by, dedicated and well-meaning people. But the system is totally untested. And I'm actually really concerned about what will happen to cases like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed getting convicted in that system, and whether it will withstand scrutiny and appeal. And then what are we going to do? We'll end up being the country, we're not going to let him go. I mean, let's face it. That will detain somebody who hasn't, been convicted in a court that withstands, international standards. That is a terrible place to be in. And that's kind of where we're headed. So I'm pretty concerned about that. And then, of course, there's the drone issue, or the drones are the mechanism for targeted killing. Human Rights Versus takes a little bit of a different tack than some human rights organizations who talk about this issue. Targeted killing for us is a good thing in war. You want your killing to be targeted. You don't want it to be, the opposite of that is indiscriminate, and that's bad. That's a war crime. But the big issue is where is the war, and how long? What's the scope? What's the duration? This is an issue that the president raised in his speech in May at the National Defense University, saying what we have been saying for a while, that persistent war is bad for our democracy, and we have to get a handle on. Yes, there are laws that apply during wartime, but there are extraordinary laws that permit things that would never be permitted in peacetime, like the intentional killing, including of civilians, if there is if there's a military objective that outweighs the risk of civilian casualties. So that is an incredibly important issue. And while we've been pushing for more transparency about the drone program, and the president has promised that, but it hasn't really delivered, promised to move this covert program into the Defense Department and outside of the CIA where it can be more transparent. That hasn't happened, and doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. So those are some, the president said in his speech that the U.S. would only launch a drone when there is a near certainty that no civilians will be killed, which is way beyond, in the laws of war, what is necessary. But, just a few weeks ago, you had the strike in Yemen on a wedding convoy that killed 12 people. So it's very unclear. We are essentially setting the rules of the road for the rest of the world on drones. And we can talk more about that if you're interested, but we're not the only ones that have drone technology, and including armed drone technology. And absent transparency about the rules that govern the U.S. use of drones, this is the playbook. The playbook allows you to do stuff like that and have no consequences. That is really terrifying. So that's all on counterterrorism, and I'll speed it up a little bit here so we have more time to talk. But I would say the major foreign policy development during the Obama administration has been the upheaval in the Middle East, even including what's going on in Ukraine right now. When in country after country, people rising up and demanding respect for their rights after decades of authoritarianism and repression. Historically, the United States had backed pretty much all of those repressive regimes in the name of stability, but with them toppling one after the other, that rationale was no longer operative. So, in my view, it was a really historic, generational opportunity for a new beginning, of the kind that President Obama talked about in his Cairo speech. Everyone's talking about the Russian reset. Well, this was the real opportunity for a reset in the Middle East. And, I think we squandered it. Not to put too fine a point on it. But I think, my sense in talking to people in the administration from the beginning of, the fall of Mubarak was really that this was viewed as more of a problem than a solution, and I think that's what made us flat-footed, slow to side with the people who were trying to overthrow dictatorship, slow to break with Mubarak, and since then our policies have been muddled at best. Aside from a few promising statements and actions, in Egypt in particular, I think the U.S. has treated the change as a burden rather than a chance to really establish the new order. And because of that, there's a lot of suspicion amongst Egyptians and others about the U.S. motive. I'm somewhat sympathetic. Obviously, there are a lot of complicated issues in the region that the U.S. is trying to advance, and in some ways, the U.S. is sort of damned if it does and damned if it doesn't, particularly on Egypt. There's suspicion that the U.S. was, if you talk to people on the street in Egypt, suspicion that we were, against, with Mubarak and trying to tamp down the, then it was that we were for Morsi, then it was that we were behind the coup that removed Morsi. There's a lot of, and that's, that's not irrational. That's the product of a very muddled U.S. message coming around Egypt. Failing to call the coup what it was, I think that was also a problem. But when the military-backed, thank you, that's so sweet of you, government removed Morsi and took back control, again, that was another opportunity for the U.S. to advance reconciliation and make sure that the Morsi supporters were brought back into the political fold, and that hasn't happened. It's always, I'm sure you'll hear something different from people from inside the administration. The U.S. always says it has less leverage than it does. Human rights groups always say that it has more leverage maybe than it does. But the fact that, Secretary Hagel has had so many personal conversations with General al-Sisi and really hasn't interacted with civil society nearly as much, hasn't taken a stand. Even when there was a minor withholding of military aid, it was almost done with the kind of, we have to do this because our stupid Congress makes us do it, but don't worry, it'll be back to normal soon. That's a little bit of a, overgeneralization, but not too much. So, and things are not all that much better in Bahrain, where there's a U.S. allied monarchy that has stayed in power and resisted reform, and has brutally suppressed the protest movement there. I think, the fact that the U.S. Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain gives us a lot of leverage. And President Obama in 2011 called for the release of the opposition leaders in Bahrain, but since then hasn't done anything or even said anything about the fact that they're still in jail. There needs to be a diplomatic, political settlement in Bahrain, and you can't have that when all of the peaceful political leadership is in jail. And what will happen now? Exactly the self-fulfilling prophecy that the Bahraini regime says, oh, the opposition is really just a front for Iran, which when I was in Bahrain and I talked to the opposition, the last thing they wanted is to trade a king in for an Ayatollah. No interest in that. But as they're looking for friends, and Iran is all too happy to be their friend. So that's another place where there's room for movement, and there hasn't really been. There's Syria, of course, which is a far more complicated situation, but there's so much. I was very frustrated by the way that the choices for U.S. policy in Syria were framed. This is an area, prevention of mass atrocities, that, in part because of the Carr Center and the work of the Carr Center, became a signature issue for the Obama administration. Stood up the Atrocities Prevention Board, but didn't publicly launch it for so long. Why? Because it was awkward that there were mass atrocities. It was a house on fire in Syria, and we weren't doing anything to stop it. And partly it's because it got framed in exactly the wrong way, and exactly not the way that we all worked to have it be framed. From Samantha Power's work and Sarah Sewell's work in the Carr Center, and the Atrocities Prevention Board, and that was that it's a binary choice, drop bombs or don't do anything, and it's not that. And there's so much that the U.S. could have done and today could be doing. That until just a few months ago, that the Pentagon had a $34 million contract with Rosaborn Export, the Russian state arms dealer, that is the primary arms supplier for Assad. Yeah, we did. And they were resistant for years of pressure that we were putting on them to cut off that contract. And we finally got it done at the end with bipartisan pressure from Congress. Finally got that contract, but there's so much more that could be done, including to cut off access by the Russian banks who are essentially doing the banking for the Central Bank of Syria, which has sanctions on it. So massive hypocrisy there. The refugee crisis, that's another area. I'm going to have to stop talking, I'm afraid, and let you guys talk so I can get my voice back. So I'm going to not tell you about international law so I can take a break. And the Human Rights Council, which was going to be a positive. So ask me about that so I can be balanced. But I got to take a break. So talk for a little bit.
And do introduce yourself and why you're here.
Speak slowly.
Speak slowly.
Try. I'm Hallie Benson. I'm a human rights lawyer. I've mostly spent my career working abroad as opposed to in the States. I'm a democracy fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation this year. My questions are on two different topics. With respect to Guantanamo, if Obama claws back or ends the AUMF, what will the legal basis for continued detention be, and will there be an effort to try to redefine war in order to continue to justify applying the laws of war? So what do you think? Because he promised in that National Archives speech to never let anybody go free who might be a danger to our national security. So it seems like he has no will to actually let detainees go. He speaks of ending the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force, which underpins Guantanamo. So I'm muddled on what his next move is. And then on a totally different topic, one of my concerns about Syria is that there had been a bright line about the use of chemical weapons. And then, it looked positive, at least for a little while, about, getting Syria to agree to an agreement with Russia. To take out the chemical weapons, but they say that about 30% of the weapons have been removed, but there have been, at least there's anecdotes that chemical weapons have been used again, and it seems like chemical weapons are a line that requires some kind of reaction. So I wanted to see if maybe you know more about that than I do.
So, I'll try to answer. On the AUMF.
You want other people to answer her? If anybody else has any answers, or ask other questions and let some things accumulate.
Let me say one thing about the AUMF. So technically what the president said was he would not sign an expansion of the AUMF. And that all wars must end, and that this war must end. Which war? That's a question. Obviously, he's staking a lot on having brought the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war drawing down by the end of this year. But the war with Al-Qaeda may be something different.
But the AMF has been what the Supreme Court has used as the basis for, the laws of war apply, and they've talked about the Hamdi decision had said when somebody challenged whether the war continued when Hamdi challenged in 2004 whether the war continued, the court had said yes, there's active battles, still going on. It's an active battlefield in Afghanistan, but left open that they might have to redefine war because it no longer looks like the wars that we're used to. So I guess I'm anticipating the administration to try to define the war against Al-Qaeda, the war against terrorism as a new form of war, very different, and what kind of precedent that's going to set.
Well, I think if we wanted to repeal the AOMF right now, we couldn't do it in Congress. It wouldn't happen. We wouldn't win. This may be one of the places where there's an unfortunate coincidence of interest. There's an increasing sense that already the administration is acting outside of the constraints of the AUMF. So some want to say, well, we need a new AUMF. Senator McCain, Senator Graham are talking about that right now. They have a draft. So it really is about, and just yesterday there was a big meeting at American Society of International Law with some administration people, and I think it's off the record and I can't say anything about it, except that was the big debate. What does it mean? What does the end of hostilities in Afghanistan mean for detention authority? All of those things are very live issues and will be hotly debated. I think that so many of the issues that we're working on, whether it's detention, interrogation, drones, it's all really related to the scope and duration of armed conflict. And there's a fundamental disagreement about whether that is the end of armed conflict is a political decision or a factual legal decision. And that a lot is going to turn on who wins that argument. What was the other issue? Oh, Syria.
Syria and chemical weapons and bright lines.
No, you're totally right. It's so frustrating. And just, it's frustrating that chemical weapons was the bright line and not the killing of 40,000 people by other means. It's also hugely frustrating that the rejection of the use of force by the American people in the context of Syria, in the face of the killing of people by chemical weapons, was viewed as a victory for peace. I find that appalling and very telling about what the legacy of Iraq and what it has done to this country and the way we view humanitarian intervention. We're just, people won't have it. And no matter how many powerful speeches Samantha gives, about what, it's just people won't have it I think it's because of Iraq. So it's a big challenge for us. I know a lot of people on the political left who were celebrating that decision as, we've kept the United States out of war. Or we prevented war. There's peace. Talk to those people in Syria about peace. There are other things that we should be doing. Okay.
Another long question, please.
Maybe mine will be a short one. I can see that for a very long time, the war in Darfur is almost now 13 years. Defined as a genocide. And still the escalation is every day. Just last week, almost more than 70,000 have been displaced, and many uncountable. Nobody knows how many have died because the UN peacekeeping mission was prevented from visiting the areas. I just want to know exactly where is the position of UN government from the genocide going in that.
Well, what do you think the U.S. ought to be doing differently?
I know there are a lot of scenarios, but somebody can do the political side of it, because I know that the economic situation, the military situation of regime, and the political side of it is very weak and very fragile. And Americans can just support the holistic solution for the position for the case of Sudan itself, and not just Darfur alone. Because I know that there is a war in in Blue Nile and in Darfur and Cote d'Ivoire, but this can be all can be solved through political dialogue, and we know where it can be pressed without military intervention. But I know this is why I'm just amazed, because nobody is just even thinking of it.
Well, I think I agree with you. I mean, I think that's right. I think that that the U.S. feels like it invested a lot. More water. We're hot. Thank you. I'm so sorry about this.
We're so sorry. Sorry to make you talk.
But, you know, these issues, you have to stick with them. You can't, you know, I think the administration wants to declare victory and put that in the win column, and obviously it's not. And it requires sustained effort, and as you said, looking at it more holistically. This is a problem for, it's not just this administration, but it's a problem with, you know, U.S. foreign policy more broadly, that, you know, that it's very short-term thinking. And, you know, the human rights in general is viewed as kind of really important, and we like it, and it's part of our identity. But it can always be deferred. It's not as pressing as, you know, other interests. And I am thinking more and more that, you know, this idea that in the long run we'll get to human rights. The long run is getting shorter for lots of reasons in our world. And we're going to face the consequences of being on the wrong side of history a lot faster than we used to. A president used to be able to say, that's somebody else's problem down the road, to deal with the legacy of support for authoritarian regimes because we need them for this or that. Those chickens are coming home to roost a lot faster now. And I think there has to be a paradigm shift in the way the U.S. is viewing its foreign policy, and the centrality of human rights to those to that policy. I think it has to change, and part of it is the acceleration of history, sort of. Yes.
Oh, I wanted to ask a question. I came across some sort of statement from the Chinese government, I think recently, the past couple of days, criticizing the United States on how it tries to be the policeman for human rights, yet internally and domestically here we have so many what they called, you know, human rights violations, from our incarceration rates, the amount of gun violence and so forth. And can you kind of speak to what credibility we have when we are so hesitant here to recognize our own human rights violations, and our ability to convince other nations to maybe adhere to you know, the same sort of code or standard that we all should be?
Sure, it's one of my favorite subjects. Because I am not one of those people who thinks that people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. I think that we should be throwing all the stones we have. And come on back with it, you know. The Chinese want to point out our human rights violations. Great, we have a whole vibrant civil society who's working on all of those issues. You know, let's get together with the Chinese civil society and see how they're doing on that. Well, we can't do that? Why? Because they're all in jail. So, you know, I think that the U.S. should not be shy about, these are universal standards. They're not things that we just quirkily happen to care about. And we all have to, you know, the U.S. has to do a better job of recognizing, and, you know, the fact that the U.S. is, and it looks like, I don't know if you saw this article in the New York Times the other day, but, you know, that they're not going to change the Bush administration's and other, you know, it's a long-term view that human rights treaty obligations don't bind the U.S. extraterritorially. That's putting us totally out of step with everybody else who we care about, and it sends this terrible message. It gives an opening to the Chinese. Why do we want to do that? That's, you know, so we have to do a better job of publicly embracing, you know, our own, the relevance of international standards to our own behavior. You know, one of the things that Mike Posner did such a good job of was under the new Human Rights Council framework, the UPR, the periodic review that every country now has to go through. You know, the Chinese always say, oh, they issue a report on the human rights situation in the United States after the U.S. puts out the country reports, where we look at everybody's performance except for our own. And the Chinese said, oh, you don't look at your own. Well, it was transformational, really, under that process. You know, Mike helped to lead in the whole human rights dream team that was in the administration, engaged with all, you know, manner of civil liberties, human rights, Native Americans, immigration, all over the country. Did like a tour of tell us how we can be better. Where are we falling short of international standards? And then those people, you know, went to Geneva, and those, you know, they were part of the process of, you know, setting out an agenda for, you know, for improvement inside the United States. That's a real breakthrough in my book, because forever, human rights was sort of the province of just the State Department, you know, because it's all externally. Human rights is what happens over there somewhere, wherever. And that's changing now, in part because of what the Obama administration did. And then at the same time, they chose to get engaged with the Human Rights Council instead of staying out of it like the Bush administration did. And that was fraught with peril because it's an institution that is political in many ways, and all manner of human rights abusing governments are in it. But Obama decided better to get in there and fight and try to make the thing do what it's supposed to do than stand outside and throw stones. And they appointed a real firecracker who took her job seriously, Eileen Donahoe, and just went to town in that place and actually got some stuff done and made it, you know, they pushed through a special rapporteur on freedom of association at a time when that was the key challenge facing human rights defenders all over the world, and, you know, tried to make it work for human rights. I give them tons of credit for that. It would have been easier to stay out, and their critics, you know, are constantly after them for being part of such a flawed institution and whatever. That's life. You know, you roll up your sleeves, you know, try to win.
I come from that context. I've worked with the United Nations for years, and I do agree with you that rejoining the Human Rights Council was important, and opening ourselves up to the periodic review was also important. But nonetheless, the serving as role model is critical. What we say and do in the UN context, we're one of 193 countries, but because we're the United States, what we say and do is writ large and long remembered. And these things that we may push aside a bit, they become larger than life in other countries' views of our conduct of human rights. And I really regret that we are no longer the paragon. We are no longer the high standard in human rights. And almost in any country where they're paying attention to these things, they can enumerate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where we have fallen short. Not just short by the top spot or two, but we're way down the road now. So good intentions are not enough on our side. We really have to do the right thing. We've got to find the language to persuade Republicans and Democrats that this matters long term, and to try to make it happen.
I could not agree with you more, and that is why we have reformulated the mission of our organization to make that our goal. We are, we're based in the United States. This is where we, live and breathe, and our mission now is to get the United States to live up to these universal values and be a leader, a more positive force for human rights in the world. And we take that on at a moment where I agree, I think, it's hardly ever been lower. But it's the critical task because, the countries that celebrate the U.S. decline in standing are the very ones that, that want to opt out of all of these human rights standards. And we, the people who suffer are the ones in those countries, and we have to build a stronger bipartisan consensus for human rights in this country. That's critically important.
Thank you for giving a long statement too and letting her rest. Go ahead. Do you have another long statement? Please.
Not so long.
Just
unfortunately.
try and lengthen it.
I'll try and lengthen it. Hi, my name is Antara and I'm a human rights lawyer from India. And I was wondering that during my time here at Kennedy, I've my understanding of US's perspective on human rights has slightly gotten skewed, I think, because before I used to think of US as being a very vocal protector of international human rights law, at least the international regime in some sense. Coming here has opened my eyes on some level to what he was saying, which is that human rights are really hierarchized in some ways in the States, where Syria is a huge problem, but DRC and Sudan and a bunch of other CAR, they are huge problems too, but they're not really given any press or people are not really talking about it. It's not considered to be important. And I wonder, is it a geographical thing? Is it is the problem the fact that it's in Africa and that's not a like a high priority issue? Is Syria a higher priority because, well, there are wars in both places and you can't really compare human lives? So what makes US's stance on one geography different from the other?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I think there are a lot of factors that go into it. One of them, I think, is, you can use the trajectory of interest in Syria as an example. All of a sudden now, because of the vacuum, because we didn't do something sooner, you have the Director of National Intelligence saying that it's become a terrorism threat to the United States, and that makes it real for people in a way that human rights abuses and the loss of lives, however tragic, somewhere else. Again, I also have to go back to, the Bush administration's kind of conflation of military solutions to human rights problems has given, humanitarian intervention and human rights a bad name. And people are concerned that when you say, human rights, we have to do something, that's going to be, that's going to entail boots on the ground or missiles in the sky. And so, no, they're not ready to invest in that. But the other part of it, though, is it's also the problem that we've always had about making people care about things that are far away and that don't impact their daily lives. A lot of that, ironically, that there was a window after 9/11 where all of a sudden people realized, hey, a lot of the people who are doing this proclaim to be doing it because, they were repressed in their countries or so. It has an impact. We should care about that. But I think that's dissipated a lot. I do think we should look not so much to what's on the front pages and what people are talking about, at the dinner table, but also what the administration is doing. And I think the appointment of Russ Feingold to be focusing on the Great Lakes area and the fact that the U.S. did play a role in the DRC in getting at least one of these horrible militias off of the battlefield. Will they follow through? Again, it's like, or is that a kind of one-off, pressuring governments to, but there's somebody who's a senior level who's invested with the authority of the president to do something about that. And so that's a positive thing. But I don't think it's a new thing. It may be new that you're seeing it close up now, but it's something I feel like we've always struggled with here. And I don't know if other countries, have the same. Americans are very parochial in a way, but they're also very generous, and they do like, there's a self-image of the United States as being a standard bearer, and most Americans, in most of the polling that I've seen, they want the United States to be leading the way in protecting human rights internationally. But if they feel like that is going to mean military intervention, especially after the last 12 years, no.
So if I could just kind of follow up on that question, I was really taken by what you said about so much it's being framed as an either-or choice, a binary choice, drop bombs or do nothing. And I'm particularly taken by that because, the human right, I just finished teaching my class on humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, etc. But, it's soft law. R2P is soft law. And there's not a single human rights treaty that says anywhere that you must or even should intervene militarily. And I kind of wonder how the human rights movement has got, I wonder how we've contributed to the binary choice, including stuff like what Samantha's doing, running around talking about the important issue is always military intervention. And whether really the human rights movement should be focusing much, much more on all the things in between doing nothing and military intervention.
Yes.
Why the fixation on military intervention? How did we get there?
Okay, I think that part of it has to do with the inherent nature of bureaucracy. That, all the other things that can be, if you get to a point where the choice is between military intervention and nothing, then you failed, right? So getting, the idea of the Atrocity Prevention Board is to, early warning and take steps and trigger decisions before it's a crisis and all of that. And it's inherently against the nature of bureaucracy to ever do that, to ever devote resources to something that's not a crisis. It's just lurching from crisis to crisis. That's how our government tends to function. We don't plan for it. We don't budget for it. We don't, and so the idea behind this is to combat that proclivity of bureaucracy. And it's just really, really hard. It's really hard. And with well-meaning people, who are human beings who only live 24 hours a day like the rest of us. And without, kind of putting somebody in charge or having leadership, real leadership on something like that, it doesn't happen. So I do think that's part of the reason is the way bureaucracies work and how, so I spend a lot of time thinking about how do you trigger action before things are a crisis, what kind of strategies are there for them, what would success look like, and how do you know when. We did this exercise actually with, at the National Defense University, this tabletop exercise is like a simulation of a mass atrocity unfolding, and brought people from all the parts of government that would need to act and kind of simulated what, with fake news reports and fake, kind of, and when do you elevate it to your boss? When do you sound the alarm? When do you force a decision? And it was very instructive for people. They frequently found themselves, by the time they were elevating it with a memo, the house was on fire, and a memo was not going to stop it. So figuring out ways to tweak the bureaucracy so that it can act faster, it's willing to act faster. And a lot of it does have to do with, I was going to say, this is my last point, I think, about personnel. If there's not somebody in there who is willing to walk into the office and say, damn it, if we don't do something on this right now, I'm leaving. This has got to be done. I will put everything on the line. Tell me what has to happen, but this is vital, and it has to, And so, there are some things like that I know from, Mike and Harold and Samantha and other people in the administration where they went to bat at a moment where it was really important. And it takes a lot of mental, emotional energy and sense of righteousness that you got to do it. And you step in and say, well, Alberto was in the middle of this kind of thing, where you said, it's like, whoa, no, that has to stop, or we have to do something about that right now. And run it up and relentlessly bother your boss until individual people can make a difference inside a bureaucracy like that.
No, I couldn't agree more just about the kind of work that Alberto was doing. The kind of question I have is, why have so many human rights debates started to always be about military intervention, instead of about what you can do within the bureaucracy to stop a more routine process of moving to torture?
Okay, I just spilled this all over myself on the camera, sorry.
Instead
yeah.
of ongoing crises in the DRC or Darfur where, what can be done, instead of the kind of thing you were saying about this military, about cutting off, our contract, instead of, it's not just, we're supplying all this money to a company that's supplying all these arms to Assad, so I'm just curious,
Yeah.
and I think it's people's fascination with war, but the human rights movement has gotten into the war business in a deep way that I'm not sure is really where we need to be.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I think that, still human rights organizations are very trepidatious about arguing for military intervention. In fact, and I do think there's a lot that we need to think about the framework for that. The default position forever has been, we're not going to think about that. That's not our job. It usually ends badly, and we don't want to be part of it. And so it kind of depends. It depends on what you mean by getting in the war business.
I guess
being willing to contemplate that there ought to be military intervention.
The focus of in the last couple of years, the focus on debate is, should we intervene militarily in Libya or not? Should we intervene militarily in Syria or not? And it seems to me that this is the big issue becomes all these debates about, do you intervene militarily or not?
So I'll give you another, yes, I totally.
All the many, many things the human rights movement could be doing.
Well, and we're doing it. We are. That's my organization. We have spent more of our time trying to cut off that Pentagon contract and get sanctions on the Russian banks than we did advocating for, bombs to be dropped. But I will say that, the most progress that we made on any of this stuff was when the president was willing to threaten military action. And that focused the mind a lot of people. It's also, I think, this is another reason for this, that's a structural reason, and that is that, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and, we have a gigantic hammer in the 5-sided building, and that's where all the money is. That's, there is a disconnect between the resources that we have in other parts of the government and the Pentagon. And, Gates understood that and spoke a lot about it, how it's not, we tend to go towards military solutions in part because that's where the capabilities are. That's where a lot of the money is. So that's a budgetary issue that needs to be changed. And I think that impacts it doesn't affect I'm not saying it explains the human rights gravitating towards military solutions so much, but overall it is the place where, if you want to stop something big from happening and there's violence involved, that's where you go.
To your point, I think that the way the U.S. is dealing with the Ukraine crisis is sort of like a counterpoint to how it could have dealt with other crises before, because now they are actually trying to use financial warfare. So instead of dropping bombs, they are actually trying to pose significant economic costs, not just sanctions, but actual costs on the Russian government. And they know that because Russia is a nuclear power, that they cannot actually go to war. And I think the fact that they can't has forced them to be more innovative in the way that they are thinking about how to protect democracy or governance in Ukraine or in Crimea. So I think that the Ukrainian crisis actually forced this point on the US. And I think that they are thinking about some sort of innovative solutions to this.
Yeah, and in fact, some of the things that they're talking about doing because of the Ukraine crisis are the things we were trying to press in, a year ago with Syria. And they said, oh, no, that's too contentious with the Russians. We need the Russians to help us solve Syria. Which, I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but, Putin's going to do what is in Putin's interest. It doesn't, if helping us on Syria is in his interest, he's not going to not do it because we put sanctions on. He's going to do it if it's in his interest, if he finds. And so I think we underestimate the leverage that we have, and we also, attribute motives to some other leaders that are maybe the way we're, anthropomorphizing them, or whatever.
Wishful thinking.
Yes, and it's just not, there. Same with the Chinese, I feel like. We say, oh, well, we have a lot of interest with the Chinese. We have to tread softly. Yes, we'll say we care about human rights, but we'll agree to disagree about all that stuff because we have these other things we have to, and it has the exact opposite effect. The Chinese perceive that as weakness. We're not willing to stand up for what we believe in. Everything's negotiable. And I don't believe in that kind of calculus. I think it's, I rarely find examples of where that's been proven to be true.
I just wanted to respond also to your question, because to some degree I think the fact that because we move from crisis to crisis, that a lot of times you hit a point where, I was living in Sri Lanka for the last 2 years of their civil war. Nobody wanted to deal with it, and then at all, period. But once it's a crisis, then it becomes about RTP, and I feel like the military intervention argument comes up because often things hit a crisis level before anybody starts to pay attention to it. And so I think it's less that the human rights organizations want that to be the solution, and more that because we only focus on crisis, it often, where RTP issues arise, and because we're much more aware of what's going on in countries, that it appears that's what's going on with human rights organizations.
It would be great if we could get the bureaucracy to focus on things before it's a crisis, but I will settle for us doing the right thing in the moment of crisis.
Elisa, in that vein, I'm sure you remember, but maybe 2 years ago, Madeleine Albright and Michelle Flournoy rolled out, first privately and then more publicly, a new Pentagon capability to analyze humanitarian intervention and advanced planning for the use of military to protect or advance humanitarian interests. I went to a dinner at Albright's house with 50 people when they were rolling out all the ideas and things like that, but I haven't heard anything about it. And I asked Mike when he was here a couple of weeks ago, well, Mike, did you get engaged in this? Was this triggered somehow? Did you work with them to? And he says, no, I haven't heard about it. Nothing. Have you heard about it? Has it been?
Mm-mm.
It's a mystery. But
Sounds like a good thing.
It's a good thing. It's a good thing because I'm always on these kinds of issues, and it's one thing to use military force, which is a very serious decision, as we've talked about. But we need to apply more of the planning that goes behind the use of military force. It's not only the kinetic element of it. It's like in Iraq, before we went into Iraq, for maybe close to a year, we were doing multi-spectrum analysis of Iraq, and it was, because I met with the targeting teams, and for example, part of the analysis was, where does every dollar go into, where does every dollar in Saddam's pocket come from, and where does it go? So you have Treasury, and then CIA, and DIA, and many others that are looking just at the financial flows. And the idea is you want to intervene in that. You don't, dropping a bomb is the last resort, but there are lots of weapons you can use on the financial sphere at all points in the Iraqi economy. Also, social network mapping, order of battle, even the more classic military mapping, but there's a lot of non-military analysis that's going on, and it can be extraordinarily elaborate. I once attended a war game, a 3-day war game at the Center for Naval Analysis, and it's highly computerized because they have all the military functions that are computerized, and so they're accelerating the timelines, but they have all the civilian functions as well, economic functions. You do this, what happens there? And then the people they had to do this was extraordinary. The U.S. president for 3 days was paid by Newt Gingrich. And they had, like, the Chinese premier was by another, like, top scholar, and then you had senior admirals and Marine Corps generals who were playing various of the military roles. So the quality of the discussions, decision-making, then the analysis, and breaking down the analysis took months to look at this. And it's that kind of thing we need to apply to the humanitarian situations like Syria.
Well, this is part of what Jill did with China and Darfur, looking at kind of the, both the weapons and the supply chain that supported mass atrocities. And it's a whole different skill set to apply to human rights challenges, looking at, kind of financial transactions, looking at, getting, understanding how Treasury works and sanctions. And, one of the things that we did with the, and this was, with an out-of-work lawyer who was camping out in our office for 2 years, he figured out that you could track shipping on a program just on his regular computer, on our computer, GPS, and he started following the shipping from the Russian seaport to the port of Tartus in Syria, and seeing that, and suspecting that there were, we've done this now several times, that there were arms in the ships, and alerting, and when we made it public, we suspected that there were attack helicopters being sent to Russia for repair and then back to help kill civilians in Syria. We didn't know for sure, obviously, but we had suspicions, and we asked them at the State Department briefing, what do they know about it? And it created this flurry of activity, and it turned out that we were right. Within, a few days, Secretary Clinton was asking Putin about it. He was denying it. It turned out to be true. And then the State Department, the Treasury Department worked with a British insurance company to pull the shipping insurance certificates of these ships, which is the thing that, you can do all kinds of things to a ship captain and threaten him and tell him he has to go to a different port, but if you take his insurance away, he's not going to sail. And that's what happened. So all of these different ways that you can. And it stopped. They just turned around and went back.
Just hearing that and the R2P question, I'm feeling a little bad for the Obama administration right now, because there are many, if 10,000 people die and then the Marines go in and further violence is stopped, they're heroic. But if no one was killed and a lot of action happens and lives are saved and there's no way to take credit for it because the world can't see it, it's hard in politics to spend money and capital on that kind of thing. I just wonder what, Kenya, post-election violence that was averted in 2013. South Sudan referendum, largely not violent. The U.S. government had a huge role in those things. And we kind of, I feel as a community, sniff at it. And we move on. We don't then say, look at what we did non-militarily. Look at what, this is great. This is the exact kind of thing. This is protecting human rights. It didn't cost lives. And we don't really take the time to do that. And I wonder if we're missing an opportunity there strategically to call attention to the very kinds of times where we put R2P into effect and spend USAID dollars and civilians on the ground and all kinds of good ambassadorial goodwill things that happen, and we don't take the time to praise. And it's
Or even to document.
Or even document.
Even document it and say, well done. These guys are great on human rights. They're great on, and to do it without undercutting then our ability to criticize, and you don't want to be jingoistic, but we do tend to just slap around and not really praise and say, this is the very behavior that we're talking about. Good job, we did it, America's. And I wonder if there's a way to kind of institutionalize that, because no one knows that Kenya was disaster averted. And it's an R2P situation that we can, I think, take credit for. But we don't.
We do a lot of the praising. We do praise particular government officials and the administration for doing this and that, which is fine. But I think the bigger thing that we have to do is to tell the story of what works. That these are examples of what works. It's not so much about who gets credit, or that's important too, but for a different reason. but to, document what works and to demonstrate that there are ways to tackle these problems before the house is on fire, and that it's cheaper, and and to build the capacity to do the things that work, because we still, I think, have a lot of problems with the capacity in the right places in the U.S. government. That I think we could do a way better job of.
One of the problems, of course, with military intervention as well as economic boycotts is that the threshold to get there, the political threshold to get there and to get others to cooperate is so high that, again, there's a resistance for paying those costs until the crisis is there. So the other aspect of these approaches is to look for valences that are much lower, can be put out much more quickly, and if they fail, just know what's next to do. I think that we want to thank Elisa for her valiant presentation.
Sorry about that.
And boy, wish you well. I think we now know that as Human Rights First is going to have the mission of having the U.S. live up to its obligations, that it will also incorporate praise and documentation about what the U.S. could be doing right, as well as a continued profound critique of what they do. And I hope you will keep us in mind, that you have 600 students here who could be put to work if they were asked to do the right thing.
Okay, I'll give you my list.
And a great deal of goodwill for the work that you have done over the years. So thank you
Well,
so
thanks.
much.
Thanks
today.
for letting us